Welcome. Tonight is the second session in our 2023 Perspectives in Sacred Space webinar series. Sharing Sacred Spaces does this once per quarter. Using a conversational format, we'll delve together into the meanings imbued in our built environment. I'm Bud Heckman. I'm a volunteer who's filling in for our Executive Director, Vanessa Avery, this evening. For those of you new to Sharing Sacred Spaces, I'll share that the organization builds bridges of understanding and trust across difference through dialogue, education, and hospitality. Most uniquely so, we do this through exploring the medium of sacred space and architecture. Our landscapes and our built environments embody meaning and contain stories. We build understanding through deciphering and reflecting on all of the inherent narratives. Research shows that this is a welcome entry point into discovering the other and invites the expansion of our understanding of our neighbors and ourselves. And I want to thank you all for being here tonight for what I'm certain will be a deep and inspiring discussion. Tonight, I have the pleasure of introducing our main presenter and his interlocutor. First, I'm pleased to introduce our special guest, Thomas Barrie. Thomas teaches and practices in Raleigh, North Carolina. Tom is a professor of architecture at the School of Architecture at North Carolina State University, where he teaches design studios focused on home and housing design, and also history and theory courses and seminars. The embodied experience of architecture, its capacity to connect us with our surroundings, others, and ourselves, the very work of what Sharing Sacred Spaces is about, and its potential to materialize our highest ideals guides his approach to design. His education in the modernist tradition and research interests in sacred architecture frame his design philosophy, which focuses on sensitive sitting, path sequences, geometry, proportion, and the authentic use of materials and sustainable practices. Tom is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects and the recipient of numerous design awards. So pleased to have you with us, Tom. Thank you for being here. I can also say that for Vanessa, because I know that she said over and over again that she's used your text in her courses that she's taught. So she's really pleased to have you joining us this evening.
That always makes this author very happy.
And his interlocutor, Dr. Michael Crosbie. Dr. Crosbie served as an editor at Architecture, the AIA Journal, Progressive Architecture, ArchitectureWeek.com, and is editor-in-chief of Faith and Form, a quarterly journal on religious art and architecture. He's also a frequent contributor to Architectural Record and Common Edge, and writes about architecture and design for the Hartford Courant in Connecticut. The author of innumerable books and prestigious academic appointments, Dr. Crosbie is a registered architect in the state of Connecticut, professor at the University of Hartford, and a board member of Sharing Sacred Spaces. Always great to be with you, Mike. We're eager for this conversation tonight, and with gratitude, I now pass the Zoom stage over to you. I'll just thank you.
I'm very happy to be here tonight, and I'm really very, very excited that Tom is going to be our presenter this evening on Buddhist architecture and Buddhism. I've known Tom for many years. We are collaborators and fellow board members for the Architecture, Culture, and Spirituality Forum. So, Tom, it's great to see you tonight, and I'm going to turn it over to you so you can launch into your presentation. Then we'll have a little time to talk, Tom and I together, and then we'll open it up for questions for all of us.
All right. Thank you, Mike. I just hope everybody that the sound is okay. If it isn't, just let me know. I'm delighted to be here and thank Making Sacred Spaces. Thank you for inviting me. I fully support your mission and do believe that architecture has a unique capacity to bring us together. So tonight's subject is Buddhism, and I'm going to start off by saying that Buddhism has been a major religious and cultural force in Asia, affecting the countries and people of over half the world's population since its formative period of over 2,500 years ago. Like the architecture of other major world religions, Buddhist architecture is a long diverse, and diffuse history spanning thousands of years and stretching across a vast geographical area. I have to advance my slides by an alternate method. I learned that with Zoom. It emerges as India from a culture that was becoming increasingly urban, with the growth of mercantile and trade classes, in part a reformation of Vedic practices of its time and their social and religious hierarchies. Buddhism begins, it is centered on a historical figure. The Buddha was born in the 6th century before the Common Era in the area of around northeast India, Nepal. During his lifetime, Buddhism grew to a large order of monks and eventually nuns. After his death in the late 5th century, before the Common Era, Buddhism spread and split into 2 major sects over doctrinal differences, though this has been overly emphasized in the West. Theravada is principally found in Southeast Asia. It's more orthodox and exclusive, focused on the principal texts of Buddhism from the Buddha's time. Mahayana is found in Korea, China, Japan, and includes what some identify as the 3rd school, Vajrayana, or Tantra, that is found in Nepal and Tibet. Generally, and these are broad terms, more heterogeneous and open, including vast cosmologies, enlightened beings and deities, and voluminous texts. At the core of Buddhism are 3 components: the Buddha, the Dharma, or the teachings, and the Sangha, the community of originally monks. These are known as the 3 refuges. A core teaching that most know are the 4 noble truths: that life is suffering, deficient, incomplete, unbalanced because of delusion, ignorance, grasping, desire, and that the overcoming of delusion is enlightenment, and the way to do so is the Eightfold Path, a map of ethical efforts, right speech, action, and livelihood, religious efforts, knowledge, concentration, effort, and individual efforts, right views, right intentions. Rarely doctrinaire, it is neither monotheistic nor theistic, but instead emphasizes orthopraxy to overcome delusion, as illustrated by the 4th noble truth. Buddhism has a consistent emphasis on individual effort, but as guided by the Buddha, informed by scripture, and supported by the community of Buddhists. It is difficult to summarize, but we can use some convenient terms. It's systematic. It provides a detailed, organized path to inner and outer development, the goal of which is enlightenment. It is practical and esoteric, scientific and psychological. It's also cosmological. Its canon includes vast, diverse, and complex cosmologies, metaphysics, multiple worlds, dimensions, Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, especially in its Tibetan and Mahayana schools. The architecture in all of its diversity can be understood as serving these core principles. And the earliest and arguably most significant examples of Buddhist architecture were monasteries, which included objects and settings to symbolize the Buddha or hold his images, in other words, places dedicated to the Buddha, buildings to store scriptures, serve the Dharma, congregational halls for study and meditation, and other buildings to serve the needs of the community of monks, or the Sangha. And especially in historically significant state-supported examples, enclosures, gateways, and path sequences, of often quite large complexes, including in some cases, circumambulatory routes, auspicious and cosmological orientations, geometry and proportion, and a diverse range of overt and generalized symbolizations. Early architecture develops from small communities of wandering mendicant monks with little interest in architecture and which forbid idolatry. But despite its aniconic beginnings, suspicion of language, and admonitions about possessions, the breadth and variety of Buddhist literature, art, and architecture has few rivals. Early monasteries and temples took the form of the stupa and the cave. The great stupa, or stupa 1 of Sanchi, was actually part of a monastic complex that included 2 other notable stupas. It dates from the 3rd century before the Common Era, or 2 centuries after the Buddha's death, and is located, if you see the arrow there, more or less right in central present-day India. Early Buddhist architecture focused on reliquaries as devotional and ritual spaces. The great stupa, or stupa number 1, which we're looking at here, which dates from around the 2nd century before the Common Era, was founded by King Asoka, a 3rd century Indian ruler who was an important early promulgator of the faith. It's located, or was located, on an important trade route, which, as it turns out, is not uncommon. Buddhist missionaries spread the faith by means of trade routes, and monasteries benefited from their location on trade routes. So even in this early work, we can see cosmological, geometric, and symbolic agendas at work. There are 4 gateways that mark the cardinal directions, symbolizing the spread of Buddhism in one interpretation to the 4 quarters. It was ritual circumambulation, traditionally, in a clockwise direction, perhaps marking and consecrating a sacred center, and certainly mirroring the direction of the sun. The stupa itself, originally, and as it was developed, was an aniconic image of the Buddha and or symbol of his enlightenment. And on top, we see a parasol, which extends deep into the solid hemisphere of the stupa, linking, in other interpretations, earth and sky, almost like, the off-sided axis mundi. At Ajanta, right, also located in central India and dating from the 6th century of the Common Era. So now we've jumped ahead quite a few centuries. This is one of a number of early Buddhist sites where sanctuaries were, and literally, carved from living rock. Turns out there was a long tradition of this in India. You see some marvelous Hindu temples created in the same way. At Ajanta, this was an important monastic center which enjoyed the patronage of the Gupta kings and a pilgrimage site. There were 30 caves in all, right? They ended up caves, but they were carved, cut into the face of rock escarpment that rises up from above the bend in a river. They include image and congregational spaces and dormitories for the monastery. Cave 26 features a stupa, but in this case, with a Buddha figure appearing in the stupa form, and very early examples of wall paintings. Both anticipate the artistic programs of Buddhism and the eventual replacement of the stupa with Buddha images. So there's a lineage of diffusion, translation, and transformation of the stupa form and its multiple symbolizations as Buddhism spread throughout Southeast Asia. Arguably, its apogee is at Borobudur, on the island of Java, dating from the 8th to 9th centuries of the Common Era. This is a solid stupa with exterior galleries containing a series of didactic panels that pictorially describe Buddhist scripture and myths, not dissimilar to what we might describe as a graphic novel. So I've mentioned stupa temples. They continue to be built, of course, after Borobudur. Here's this 12th century one in Burma, current day Myanmar. So Borobudur was one of a number, actually, of important Buddhist monuments in this part of the island of Java. Like the Myanmar example, it has a series of concentric terraces that are used for circumambulation, along which are panels, which you can see in this slide here. On the left-hand side of the gallery are 2 sets of panels, and on the right are 2 as well. So 4 panels, 2 on each side. And in the lower galleries, they include depictions of the life of the Sakyamuni Buddha, or the last incarnation of the Buddha. Pilgrims will do a ritual clockwise circumambulation, and to read the entire life of the what we call the historical or Sakyamuni Buddha, you have to circumambulate. Sorry about that. You have to circumambulate 10 times, right? And which is a distance of just about 3 miles. To work your way all the way up to the top is even further. So here's an example of some of these panels, right? This is the whole story of the Buddha and his miraculous birth. There's his mother, Queen Maya, going to the paradisical Lumbini gardens. There she is giving birth. There's the Buddha after he becomes dissatisfied, leaving his palaces to take up the life of a mendicant monk, and then arriving underneath the Bo tree where he achieves enlightenment. Much shortened version. So you work your way up, pilgrims work their way up through these galleries, each fully enclosed. So you can't see very far from each gallery within the gallery itself to the next until it opens up in what are known as the upper terraces. Here we find 72 Buddha figures in a variety of what are known as mudra poses. A very popular one, which we're seeing here, is known as the Dharma Chakra, which translates roughly as turning the wheel of the doctrine, and it's a symbol of the Buddha's first talk to his, to the first 5 members of his Sangha. Sorry, we just don't know what to do with our phones. So this is a stupa form, but more importantly, or more significantly, it's a mandala plan, and which incorporates mandala symbolism. Now, mandalas are popular meditative devices, aids for spiritual edification that create a symbolic journey along circumambulatory path to a sacred center. At Borobudur, vast cosmological symbolisms are paired with an individual path taken by pilgrims who symbolically rise through levels of realization, right? Symbolically, a reciprocity of architectural symbolism and ritual. We now turn to China. Buddhism traveled along trade routes, again, to China, principally along the Silk Route in the northern part of present-day China, arriving in China around the 1st century of the Common Era. Its beliefs and practices further expand as it melds with the indigenous Taoist religion, especially the sacred geographies, sacred mountains, and monastic centers located in them of Taoism. What happens is a remarkable adaptation and assimilation, unprecedented in some ways, or repeated. Early and important centers were located in mountainous regions, though Buddhism had no tradition before this of having monasteries in mountains. And what emerges, again, coming out of Taoism, are what are known now today as the 4 famous Buddhist mountains. Sacred geographies of mountainous areas positioned as settings for cultivating Buddhist communities and where the Mahayana promise of universal enlightenment was portentous. I'm going to take you to one of these. This is Wutishan, is located right where the arrow shows in northern present-day China, actually quite close to Beijing, and it is one of the 4 famous Buddhist mountains. At one time, there were over 200 monasteries located on the slopes, valleys, and peaks, some located at up to 10,000 feet elevation in this mountainous region, in northern China near the terminus of the Silk Road and the Great Wall. Today, about 50 remain. Chinese Buddhist architecture developed its own distinct temple and monastic architecture. Monastic models developed from mountains, primarily mountainside sites, with quadrangle layouts, axial organizations, all derived from what we call palace courtyard models. In other words, a conflation of the domestic, the political, and the religious. An important temple monastery is Shantang, which you see here, just up the slope from what's considered to be the center of the Wutishan. Its buildings date originally from the 1st century of the Common Era, though most are much later now. As you see on the plan on the right, it has a palace temple layout and is an extensive campus of gateways, temples, courtyards, and monastic buildings. Distinctive wooden trabeated construction with dominant roofs was first developed in China, but found unique translations and expressions in Korea and Japan. So I'm going to turn to a very important early Chinese example before then journeying on to Korea and Japan. This is Foguang Monastery, dates from the 9th century of the Common Era. And it's located outside the main valley of Wutishan, but is relatively close by. Once again, we found a mountainside walled compound with a courtyard palace configuration with a main courtyard fronted by major temples, which you can see on the plan, and 3 terraces that rise up to the main temple. You see in the section there of the Buddha Hall. We're looking at the Manjusri Hall. This is, a very popular bodhisattva, particularly in this part of China, the bodhisattva of infinite wisdom. So you journey on your way up through a quite remarkable series of steps and passages until you arrive at this classic example of trabeated, bracketed wooden temple construction. It is a remarkable building. And all of which, right, the palace courtyard, the path sequence, the gateways, the secondary temples to bodhisattvas, and then ultimately arriving at the main Buddha hall. These are all elements of organizations that we will observe in Korean examples and Japanese examples. So let's go there now. Buddhism arrived in Korea from Japan in the 4th century of the Common Era and flourished during the United Sia dynasty, 7th to the 10th century of the Common Era, where it enjoyed consistent state support. It was a time of ambitious building programs at many monasteries. Buddhism arrives in Japan from Korea 2 centuries later. Similar to Korea, it enjoys long periods of state support until the Meiji era of the around mid-19th century. Both countries produced significant Buddhist architecture, most of which was centered on its monasteries. Tangdosa is one of the most historically significant monasteries in Korea. It's a Zen monastery, which most are in Korea. It's one of the 3 jewels, right? There are 3 principal monasteries: Sangwonsa, dedicated to the Sangha; Hainsa, dedicated to the Dharma; and Tangdosa, dedicated to the Buddha. It is sited auspiciously sited at the base of a mountain along the bend in a river. You approach from the east, a little unusual, but the main temples face south, and it includes a sequence of bridges, some very poetically named: Half Moon and 3 Stars, Shade of Half Moon. And the path then starts with what's known as the 1-pillar gate, which you say down in the lower right there, which symbolizes the unity of the Dharma and what gets referred to as the one vehicle, right, of Buddhism. It's also very practical because one of the writings says, this is a monastery, be quiet. Next, you come along, and this is what is known as the 4 Guardians Gate. This is unique to Korea. These are what are described as Hindu-derived deities, each guarding a cardinal direction. They're the sentries of the monastery. Moving through that, you get to the area of the first courtyard, and it was immediately come across the bell tower. The bell tower is central to the life of the monastery because it actually regulates the monastery, not dissimilar to Christian monasteries, but of course, very different in significant ways. Because not only does it regulate the life, but in the instruments that are actually developed and played, it symbolizes the cosmic aspects of Mahayana Buddhism. In ringing the 4 of the instruments, there's a cloud gong, there's a fish gong, there's a big drum, and then there's a big bell, calling the 4 realms of the Dharma: the air, the water, the earth, and the underworld. So there's 3 courtyards. You can see at the lower part of the plan there, the desire court, the material court, and then the non-material court. And let's go take a look at these. So here's the first courtyard. It's on the upper right there. This contains more of the practical shrines of, for prayer. There's the medicine Buddha and the Amida Buddha, the Buddha of the Western Paradise, and so forth. Journeying on, you get to what is known as the non-duality gate that is in the center there of the images. Very important concept in Buddhism, and you pass through that to get to the next courtyard, around which there is a Buddhist college. Right? This is a they're Buddhists, but they are of a certain they play a certain role and perform certain activities in the monastery, and I'll explain that a little bit more. But this is where they study traditional Chinese, they study the scriptures and so forth. And then passing on, you can see where the two arrows are pointing now, you get to the third courtyard, the courtyard of the Buddha. Lower right, we're looking at the main, what Koreans refer to as the hero hall. And there's another view of it. And then if you look back where the arrow has just gone, there is a lecture hall that serves purposes, right, of the monastery. There's always lecture hall. And then lastly, if you see the last arrow there, it points to a whole other quadrangle, which I could never get in because it is for sequestered meditation monks. They live lives separate from the monastery, devoting their lives to principally to meditation for a total of about 6 months a year. So the Hero Hall or Buddha Hall is unusual here. It's unusual because if you look at it, you can see there's something missing. And that's a statue of the Buddha, or statue of bodhisattvas, or statues of anything, right? It only has an altar, but with windows that look out towards the back where there is a stupa, believed to contain relics of the Sakyamuni Buddha. So throughout, there are multiple reads and interpretations that one can talk about with this monastery. First of all, not uncommonly, its plan has been associated with a mandala pattern. And this is actually a Korean mandala there that shows at its very center the Virakana Buddha, the cosmic or primordial Buddha, who is located at the center of Buddhist cosmology. And at this monastery, I've gone through the different courtyards, right? The first one is really the courtyard of human desire. That's petitionary prayers and so forth. And there's folk religion that actually gets what Koreans refer to as shamanism, is also incorporated into the prayers and shrines. I didn't have time to talk about those. There's the Buddhist college to serve the Sangha. There's the courtyard of the Buddha Hall, the Hero Hall to serve the Buddha. There is the meditation monk quadrangle to serve the bodhisattvas, right? The guides towards meditation. And then lastly, the mountain behind is also considered to be part of the Buddha realm, and is associated with with Vulture Peak, from Buddhist mythology, the place where Buddha delivered the Lotus Sutra. The Lotus Sutra, probably the most beloved of sutras in the Mahayana canon. And then inside, when you look up at this beautifully carved wooden ceiling, there are flowers painted on there and carved. They create a center, they create a primordial spot, while also recalling how flowers rained from the heavens when the Buddha gave his first Dharma talk. Throughout, you can see that the monastery serves a lot of different rituals, from, you might say lower to higher or higher to lower, however you want to look at it, evincing a broad variety of interpretations and experiences. Truly a kind of integrated experience, but throughout, underneath a pretentious place, we're crossing over on the vehicle of Buddhism to enlightenment is possible. So let's go to Japan. And we're going to look at a couple of monasteries. This is Hoyuji, located in Nara, built in Nara, which was an early important political and Buddhist center dating from the early 7th century of the Common Era. And in Japan, monasteries reflect monastic models imported from China and Korea, but the architecture takes on particular Japanese expression, including here a 105-foot pagoda, really a mature expression of a distinctive Japanese style. Some might say it's efflorescence, because the pagoda, as in Korea, will eventually be replaced by the image hall, which we find at Nara, also at Hoiuji, in that image hall there, the central hall or kondo you see at the right center of the courtyard, which contains statues of the Buddha and 2 bodhisattvas. Now we go to Kyoto, the cultural capital, and at points the political capital of Japan, and probably one of the more well-known Buddhist monasteries, Daitokuji. This is a Rinzai Zen monastery, 2 main sects in Japan, Rinzai and Soto Zen, and probably one of the most important from the medieval period of Japan, 1200 to 1600. This is a mountain temple located auspiciously on the southern slopes of the mountains that, once again, auspiciously surround Kyoto. Kyoto itself built in the feng shui auspicious belly of the dragon, where the 2 rivers come together. And during its time, of course, it enjoyed long periods of of patronage from imperial and military rulers. So it's a walled compound, or at least originally it was, that faces south. It's the auspicious direction with axial alignments of the main temple buildings. And its plan of the main temple buildings has been compared to a mandala as well, and those multifarious interpretations and symbolizations that it suggests. First, there is the outer gate. You see number 1 there, and on the upper right, along this largely symbolic path, because you really don't walk it. There are monastery pathways that you can see stippled in on that plan. So this is the Chokoshumen, the outer gate, and was reserved primarily for royal visits. Right? It's again a conflation of cultural, political, and religious symbols. Next is the Sanman, or mountain gate, symbolizing the sacred mountain, right? And in some interpretations, the center of a mandala. Next is the Butsuden, right? The image hall with a statue of the Sakyamuni Buddha with a dragon on its ceiling, in an ambulatory around it. You can see that, the slide, inscribed in the floor. Twice a month, there is a ceremony where the abbots from the sub-temples come. They're convened by the abbot of the monastery to circumambulate around the altar. Both consecrating and creating the mandala pattern and center of the universe, of the monastery. So I mentioned sub-temples. Sub-temples are a particular Japanese variation on the typical monastic plan, where each sub-temple has its own abbot and sangha. So we're going to look at Koto-in, you see where the arrow has just gone, and take a look at its rich path and volumetric sequence and symbolic narrative that, in mine and a few others' interpretation, recapitulates, symbolizes, and its ambulation recapitulates a pilgrimage to what's known as the Hermit Scholars Retreat, celebrated in Taoist and Zen art and literature. This has roots in the first monasteries in China and in Korea and Japan, of monasteries growing from a simple mountainside hermitage. Daitokuji was founded by a solitary monk, Daitokukushi. Similar founder myths and stories are found in Korea and Japan. So let's take a look at this path sequence. You start in an outer courtyard, leaving the monastery avenues, and I I could spend a long time talking about this, but I won't. And you'll see that you move through inscriptions, volumes, passageways, gateways, turns and twists over a variety of paving patterns. You finally turn and face the main gateway along the path into this in-between space called the Genkan, and then until finally the Hojo is revealed, and it's much celebrated maple garden. This isn't the dry gardens, but is a variation of it, of the moss and maple garden. So I mentioned the name of this, it's the Hojo. This is what is also known as the abbot's quarters. And Hojo roughly translates as one jo, or tatami square, recalling a mythical 4.5 mat room where a legendary Buddhist sage accommodated thousands of disciples. So there is a tradition in Japan, unique to Japan, of novice monks traveling from the monastery where they have completed their first trainings to a monastery where they want to find a home. They journey to Daitokaji. They journey along the paths of the monastery, the avenues. They come to the entrance of Koto-in. They journey along that whole path sequence till they get to the outer veranda, where they ask permission to enter the monastery to be admitted. What follows are up to 3 days of rituals. The lesson is clear, the symbolism's quite potent. This melding of ritual, symbol, and the practical exigencies of finding a monastery. The path and the mimesis, right, of the walking along the path, communicating, symbolizing the spiritual path to the sacred center. So the heterogeneous nature of Korean and Japanese monastic architecture is consistent with the history of Buddhist architecture. The Buddha taught to the level of each student, adapting his teachings according to their ability to understand. His skillful means is a central Buddhist concept, and bodhisattvas were celebrated for their skills in guiding adepts to the ultimate truth of enlightenment through relative means. Similarly, as Buddhism encountered other cultures that adapted and expanded according to its context, resulting in a remarkable diversity of scriptures, schools of thought, and practices. Buddhism never had a central authority, never had a religion-specific building typology. Consequently, its architecture was free to adopt and transform existing building types and organizations. From stupas to cave monasteries to pagoda temples, sacred geographies, and diverse interpretations of palace courtyard monastic layouts, the syncretic nature of Buddhism produced an architecture that was often an amalgam of influences where the practical, symbolic, and ritual demands of the three refuges found distinct expression. Thank you.
Tom, thank you. Thank you very much. This is a wonderful presentation. And I also wanted to comment on the images, many of which I think are yours, right? That
Yes.
you photographed, and your wonderful drawings, which are throughout this presentation and explain these buildings and this architecture so well. So congratulations, a beautiful presentation. I had a quick question I wanted to ask before we turn this over to our audience members. And that is the concept of sacredness. You know, this organization is sharing sacred spaces. And this, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the concept of sacredness in Buddhism. I mean, in Western Christianity, the concept of sacredness is different for different denominations, different sects, and so forth. Is there how would you describe the sense of sacredness for Buddhists?
Well, first of all, it's going to vary, and over time and over cultures. But I'd say, and one can, though, identify certain attributes of conceptions of the sacred in Buddhist architecture that one can also find in other religious traditions, though with differences, inflections to culture, and so forth.
Yeah.
These the monasteries that I've shown, particularly the Korean, Chinese, Japanese ones, these were these were religious centers,
Yes.
but they were political centers as well,
Yeah.
and they were cultural centers as well, and they have changed over time. Daitokuji is really no longer a functioning monastery, but it is a national treasure. And so those who visit it now have, a quite different interpretation of what the sacred is and so forth.
Yeah.
And monasteries are still quite vibrant, at least some of them.
Mm-hmm.
The slide on the upper left there is actually a remote Korean monastery that I just tell you is very difficult to get to, right? And so, so you do find, first of all, and that kind of material culture, right, that we find in religious architecture that is deeply embedded in culture, political realm, and so forth, as state architecture typically is. These are a place apart often. The practical exigencies of monastic settings, of course, is that they do need to be separate.
Yeah.
And in all of the countries, particularly Korea and Japan, it had some practicality because there were times when the monasteries were not favored by the state, and it was best to shut their gates at night.
Be the further away from the power, the better you were.
Yeah. There's authoritative places or places of hierophanies, right? That mark places, right? Daitokuji and the founding of the monastery, he was a great teacher. Who, as the way the story goes, said, "Enough of the world. I am going to the mountains, like the Taoists did, and dedicate my life to meditation." And that's where they found him, and that's how the monasteries first built up. And the sacred, of course, is episodic. It is created in many different ways. There one can identify on one hand, the typologies of sacred places, of their organizations, hierarchical connections to the cosmos, and so forth. But they're also created through ritual, and sometimes they are moving between and across those two worlds.
Right.
So if you think about the Korean monastery at Tongdosa, in the lower realms there, I noticed mostly older people praying at the medicine Buddha or at the Buddha of the future, the Buddha of the afterlife. Right? At the Buddhist college, a bunch of young men studying scripture, studying Chinese, using the sutra library, and so forth. Had a kind of a familiar feel to it. You go up to the upper realm, and there's a temple called the Judgment Hall, and that's for funerals. And so you get a very different audience there, folks who have lost their loved ones. You have devout people coming there. You have school kids
Yeah.
What happens is that I cannot silence my phone for my family because I've set it up that way. And when I was there, it looked like a kind of club of elderly women who kind of took care of things.
Yeah.
And they were often just sitting around the Buddha hall, not acting particularly reverential, and
Yes.
it didn't bother me one bit. So you're going to get me going, but I'm going to stop here.
Okay.
So, on one hand, I could describe it, sort of answer it as a remedy, right? So we're going to remedy something that needs fixing, or as a, simply as a beneficent approach. And I would just start and probably end with a core Buddhist teaching of no self. And no self is very difficult for Westerners to understand, including this Westerner. But in essence, I would describe it as you recognize that you are an incarnate self, right? Obviously, Tom Barrie sitting here, I'm in a body, I have a voice, right, and emotions and feelings and all that. I'm clearly a being, right, that's alive. But from the Buddhist point of view, the question that comes up is, well, who were you yesterday? And who were you when you were a child? Who were you when you were in that car accident? Who were you when you got married? Who will you be in the future? And when you try to pin that down, I know who I am right now, but I say, oh, well, I'm not sure. See how you change over time. And our conceptions and so forth change over time. So part of that is not that there's no self, there is no stable, dependable self. And then the other thing is that, and Thich Nhat Hanh was very good about describing this in his concept of interbeing, is that what we perceive as a separate self is really only one part of a multiple set of what you might call selves. That we cannot exist without our intrinsic interrelationship with other beings, with other humans, with the world, and so forth. So that even though we may be a separate object, right, that, and I mean that kind of in an objective sense, we can only understand ourselves in relationship to an ever-shifting set of contexts. And all to say, I mean, if you, for example, if you look at a school of fish swimming in a big pool, right? And, you say, which is that fish?
Exactly.
They're just fish.
Yeah, the fish.
And if one fish dies, we're not sad because the fish live on. So for me, then, as a designer, right, that can be an aid in getting out of our Western-centric, progressive, intoxication of the new that has, I would say, infected architectural culture as well as the humanities in general. And so in that sense, then it is an antidote where we realize, right, that we may be designing something that someone says, wow, boy, that's so inventive and new. But we're only able to design it
Yeah.
because of others.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it only gets built because of
You
others.
have filled our hour with an incredible presentation and given us a lot of things to think about. And I really appreciate the time you spent with us and for sharing your gifts and your intellect and your expository talents. And I want to thank you all for being with us this evening. And look forward to having you join us in future for another episode in this series. So thank you very, very much. And
Highlight a couple of those for you, if you'd like.
pardon me?
I'll highlight a couple of the upcoming events, if you'd like.
Okay, sure, bud.
We have an inspiring lineup of events coming in the coming months and more conversations, just like the one that you participated in tonight. I'll mention just a couple of them that are in real life and a couple of them that are virtual, like this one. In June, if you're in Northern Virginia area, we will have an interfaith visit and architectural exploration of the Chinmaya Mission Hindu ashram. In July, also in Northern Virginia, where we have an instance of our Interreligious Communities Project, we'll be conducting an interfaith visit and architectural exploration of St. Bernadette's Catholic Church. In the fall, online on September 13th, we'll feature a Zoroastrian scholar, practicing architect Cyrus Revetna, who built the only ever wood-burning fire temple in the country. Cyrus will speak to us about the Zoroastrian religion, how its values and beliefs are embodied in the fire temple design. Also online in the fall, we will have our second annual Building Bridges Summit, and including an incredible lineup of interviews with influencers who are creating positive change from their very different contexts. You can subscribe on our website, sharingsacredspaces.org, to stay informed about our upcoming Building Bridges Summit and all the opportunities that I mentioned. I want to thank you, everyone, for being here and for all that you do to bring out compassion and beauty in the world. And if you'd like to join us, volunteer, or invest in our mission, please look for the link that I dropped into the chat there. Our end of the year fiscal year is coming up in late June, so philanthropic gestures are welcome and appreciated. Every investment goes towards achieving our mission and increasing understanding and building community. Thank you again to our wonderful guest, Professor Tom Barrie, and as always, our clever host, Dr. Michael Crosbie. We'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you all. Take care.
Thank you.